I want to give a big shout out to our partner, Seven Bridges. I was just at the Saigon tap room on the weekend on Le Canton, and I've got to tell you about my new favorite beer there, which is called Head in the Clouds. It's their newest Session Hazy IPA, and it's inspired by my actual favorite, the High Van Haze. The High Van Haze is an IPA which is 6%, and the Head in the Clouds is a much lower strength beer, only 4.4%, which means you can have a few without being too drunk. The Head in the Clouds, it's packed with tropical fruit, citrus, passion fruit flavors. It's bold, juicy, delicious. And as I mentioned, it's super sessionable. So it's perfect when you just want a couple of beers without going overboard with the High Van Haze. And don't forget the delicious New York style pizza slices if you go. If you do go, make sure you tell them you heard it on a Vietnam podcast.
And I got to give a special shout out to one of my favourite places in the world, and it's the Rabbit Hole Irish Sports Bar. Come and join me every Tuesday night where I do the quiz night at the Phan Viet Chan location. It's always a lot of fun, but not a lot of people know that they opened up a second location on Chan Now in D2, the other side of D2. It's an incredible rooftop with one of the best views in the city overlooking Landmark 81. So make sure you check out Rabbit Hole Irish Sports Bar on Phan Viet Chan and Chan Now. They show all the live sports, all the Seven Nations, everything that you want to see. They have the Saigon Pool League. They have unbelievable food, amazing beer, and best of all, they have me every Tuesday night at the quiz night. So I will hopefully see you there. And Ian from the Rabbit Hole has told me, just for you, a Vietnam podcast listeners, the first 5 people to contact me are going to get a free drink on him when you go to the Chan Now location. So get in touch now, quick, don't wait, do it before this episode. Go.
Vietnam is the number 2 producer of coffee in the world, which blew my mind because I didn't know that as a Vietnamese American. The specialty coffee industry in America was really built around this idea and this narrative of 100% Arabica is superior. Vietnam is instant coffee, Vietnam is cheap, Vietnam is Robusta, which I really felt like was wrong and fucked up, and it needed to change.
Welcome to another episode of a Vietnam podcast with me, your host, Neil Mackay. I started this podcast in 2019 as a hobby because I was bored one day and I loved living in Saigon. So it was called 7 Million Bikes, a Saigon podcast, because there were 7 million bikes in Saigon at the time. And it eventually became a Vietnam podcast. And we now talk to people from all over the world, all over Vietnam, all connected to Vietnam with a story to share. And even if it's my own story. I first came here in 2015, came back in 2016 for 6 weeks. And that was it. I'm still here in 2025. I absolutely love this country, love this podcast, and I'm really proud to say that this show is now in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. So thank you so much to you for listening. So today we're bringing back an old conversation that I think is just as valuable now as when it first came out. In this episode, I sat down with Sarah Nguyen online during COVID times, a Vietnamese American entrepreneur and the founder of Nguyen Coffee Supply. It has been amazing seeing the transformation of this company over the years. She is on a mission to transform the coffee industry through diversity, inclusion, and transparency. And we talked about her journey, her passion for specialty Vietnamese coffee, and the impact of her work on both farmers and consumers. So whether you missed it the first time or you want to revisit this inspiring conversation, I'm sure you're going to love it. So let's get started. Cheers. Today we got a little bit of a different podcast. We're recording on Zoom, so hopefully the audio quality is still as good as what you're used to, but it might be a little bit different. Now, my guest today, she is on a mission to transform the coffee industry through diversity, inclusion, and transparency. And her company has been featured recently in the Wall Street Journal, Vice, New York Magazine, New York Times, Forbes, Fortune, and was one of the 2019 Star Chef's Rising Stars. Now, she is the founder and CEO of Nguyen Coffee Supply, which is America's first specialty Vietnamese coffee importer and roaster, and has recently been on the Drew Barrymore TV show, which I'm excited to ask her about Drew Barrymore. And she's been on several other podcasts and Zoom panels talking about Nguyen Coffee Supply, but also her activism in support of the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, especially in the light of the recent violence towards this community in America. So I'm excited to introduce my guest today is Sarah Nguyen.
Hi, Neil. Thank you so much for having me.
thank you for coming on. I've been very excited to talk to you since I saw that you did an AMA, which is Ask Me Anything for anyone who's not in the know on Reddit. How did that go?
It was amazing. I'm so happy that you were able to find it, because the goal of doing AMAs is to find more community with people all across the internet in the world. So that's so cool.
Well, I'm always on the lookout for interesting people to interview that are connected to Vietnam. So whether that's someone who's Vietnamese American or Vietnamese German, Swiss, we've had VQs from all over the world and within Vietnam on the show. So as soon as I saw that and I read that, I was like, oh, I reached out right away. And then I've been chatting to Alex, your communications guy. Which, did he tell you about our crazy connection?
No, he didn't. Tell me.
So I sent to you and him a couple of episodes from previous shows to check out, thought you might be interested in. And one of them I sent is from a girl called Lemin Tam, Houston-based Vietnamese American, but she lived here in Saigon for a while and started a closed-door restaurant called Saigonista. Anyway, super interesting episode. I sent that to Alex and he replied back, I just had dinner with her last week.
That's amazing.
What a small world, eh?
Yeah, what a small world.
Now, so one of the things we've talked about on this season was the pronunciation of names and the meaning of names. And the common question I always get is, how do I say your name? And most people get it wrong. I've had people that have known me for years and still say my name wrong. Now, I listened to one of your many videos. You did a TED Talk, which was fascinating. And it was like nails on a chalkboard when I listened to it, because the first thing you said was New Win Coffee Supply.
Yeah.
What is the name of your coffee company and your last name?
So my last name in Vietnamese with the diacritics is Nguyen. However, in English, the English language does not have diacritics. So the sounds that exist in Vietnamese just literally don't exist in English. So the anglicized versions of my last name, there are many versions, and some people would say it's Nguyen, some people would say it's Nguyen, some people would say it's Nguyen. My parents literally say Nguyen, right? And so it's interesting because when I first started the company, and the time when you saw this TED Talk, which is like at the very beginning days of the company, I entered the market saying Nguyen Coffee Supply because I didn't know if people who are non-Vietnamese could handle. In my mind, I was trying to make it as anglicized as possible. But what's funny, Neil, is that over time, non-Vietnamese Americans would come up to me and say, wait a minute, isn't it Nguyen? And so it's just a fascinating, I guess, like journey of the Vietnamese American experience in America, really. And this is a larger conversation about language, linguistics, and diacritics. So now I say Nguyen more commonly because I feel like that's the commonly accepted anglicized version of mainstream America. However, my last name in Vietnamese is still Nguyen.
And I make fun, but I've been here 5 years and I still can't say it properly. I try, but because the NG is like you got to get it like the, and then it's like sing, right? Like the best way it was explained to me is think of sing, but take the sound at the end and put it at the beginning. For someone from Scotland, that's almost impossible to do. So I'm probably still saying it wrong. And it's good to know that was an early TED Talk. But yeah, when I did hear that, I was like, wait, what?
So one of the things that I've learned about Vietnamese, the language, is that the NG is in the back of your throat, right? So I think when you think about where the sound comes from, it helps a lot. So the NG Vietnamese is back of your throat. So you should feel it back there like Nguyen, whereas the N in English is on the tip of your tongue, right? Like Nancy. So it's total opposites, really, which is why when people always ask me, how do you say your last name in English? You literally can't because it's just different worlds, right? But yeah, so just aim for the back of your throat, Neil, and just go Nguyen.
What also made me laugh is last season we had a guest on, and his last name was, of course, Nguyen. And so in the UK, he would pronounce it Nugent up until then eventually he was 26. And I said to him, did your parents never correct you? Like he said, well, no, that I was brought up saying it like this. And so now he lives over here and similar experience, then you have to start pronouncing it correctly.
Literally grew up saying Nugent as well. And so I grew up saying Nugent throughout the 80s and 90s and even 2000s. And it's interesting how even with my own journey as a Vietnamese American, I've evolved with Nugent, Nguyen and Nguyen, right? So I think it's all a story of like the diaspora in different social cultural contexts.
Yeah, for sure. And I can relate in a way, but probably not really. But my last name is Mackay, but it can be called McKay, McKee, and you can get any different types of pronunciations. So I'm very used to it as well. I get it every day, and especially like with my first name as well. So I often get, like, you could be waiting for your name to be called out, and it'll be Niall Mackey, and I'm like, oh, that's me, Neil Mackay. Yeah, totally different. So where are your parents from in Vietnam?
My dad is from Hanoi in the north, and my mom is originally from Quang Ngai. That's her hometown, which is more central. However, most of like the family on my mom's side is now in Nha Trang.
Nice. Have you been there?
Yeah, I grew up visiting. So most of my family relatives are still in Vietnam. My parents are like one of 8 siblings each. And so they were the only ones to escape the country. So I grew up with a really small family in the United States, like literally just my parents and my siblings. And so my whole extended family, my aunts, my uncles, all my cousins are still in Vietnam. So I was really fortunate as a young person to be able to go back and visit often. And then as I got older as an adult, I was able to kind of go back on my own.
I've been podcasting for years, and the number one tool that helped me become an award-winning podcast producer is the script. No matter whether you're a tech wizard or a beginner like me, the script can help you with everything you need to start your own podcast. If you want to start your own podcast today, download the script. The link is in the show notes. It's my number one recommendation to help you create a podcast easily, smoothly, and it has heaps of AI features that make your podcasting even better. So check it out. Let me know what you think. Let's get back to the episode. Now, I asked this question to nearly every guest that wasn't born in Vietnam and lived here the whole life. Do you speak Vietnamese?
I do speak Vietnamese. I speak and read and write in Vietnamese, which helps me a lot in doing my current business.
That's good. Yeah, because often some of our guests we've had on that I just interviewed was he didn't learn his parents were Vietnamese and Laotian, but he didn't learn Vietnamese until he moved here at like 30 years old, which was obviously a big challenge to learn Vietnamese at that age. But he's almost fluent now.
Yeah.
It's talk about this often, and it's embarrassing. I've been here for 5 years now, and like most expats that live here, I don't speak Vietnamese. And as one of my comedian friends does a joke about this recently, he's like, I think more expats would speak Vietnamese if it wasn't so difficult.
Well, it's like Vietnamese, it's a diacritics, right? It's a tonal language. There are tones and sounds that just simply don't exist in other languages. So for that reason, and it's also like, because of the tones and the tones and like the different accents, your tongue is a muscle, right? There are muscles in your tongue. And so you have to have like flexed or trained your tongue to kind of like flex or speak in these different tones and accents. And so if you literally like never worked that muscle, it's kind of like difficult to build up. Not impossible, but yeah, it's definitely be a bit more challenging.
I did do some Vietnamese lessons when I first came here. And I remember after an hour of lessons, like my jaw was in pain, my throat was in pain. And I just saw a friend post yesterday that he's restarted Vietnamese lessons. And he's like, my mouth is in agony. It is really difficult.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
On the flip side, so I teach English here as well. And there's sounds in the English language that they don't have in Vietnam. So for example, the biggest example is the TH sound, like the, which just doesn't exist. So trying to teach that to children, and again, like you're talking about, you have to get the tongue. It's like, put your tongue, like things like this. So it goes both ways as well. I understand. And it's the same thing, like they don't have that muscle memory of, it's funny, like with little kids, they're easier to learn because they don't have that. But especially for adults, when you teach them and you're like, no, put your tongue here and do this, they've never done it before. So it's so difficult.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So when did your parents leave Vietnam?
They left around 1978.
And is that something we can talk about in more detail?
Sure, as much as I know.
I just want to go back quickly because we're going to move on from talking in Vietnamese. One of the jokes that I tell on stage often, and that I learned this from my Vietnamese colleague, one of the reasons is, like you say, the tones. So you take the word NAM, and you can change the inflection, and that 3-letter word can make 7 different meanings. And so I will often get someone up on stage who can speak Vietnamese, who either is an expat or a Vietnamese local, and say this sentence. So I'm going to get you to say this sentence, okay? I've had previous guests do this.
Sure.
My last guest that did it was a French-Russian girl who speaks fluent Vietnamese. The one before that was Nigerian who speaks fluent Vietnamese. So let's see if we're going to test your Vietnamese, okay?
Okay, sure.
Okay, the sentence is nonsensical. This is the sentence in English. I lay with a man called Nam, holding 5 mushrooms for 5 years. As a non-Vietnamese speaker, it's so difficult to hear the 7 different tones of Nam there.
Yeah, that was a good one. I've never done that one.
Can you give me it one more time, but faster? I lay in bed with a man called Nam, holding 5 mushrooms for 5 years.
Tôi nằm trong cái giường với cái nắm cái nắm cho 5 năm. That was like a tongue twister.
I love watching your face doing this as well, because you're like thinking about the tone on each one. I can watch you go like, is it up? Is it down? Is it flat?
Yeah, I definitely can't do it really fast. It's like a tongue twister. So I like gotta visualize it.
So tell me then about your parents left Vietnam. When did they leave Vietnam and what brought them to America?
Yeah, so my parents, it was like shortly after the war ended, and it was a really difficult time. Both my parents and their families, and my parents' families were just struggling. Like no one had any work. People didn't have enough to eat. They were eating like rice and mixing potatoes with their rice to try to extend it. It was just a difficult time. And I guess for my parents' generation, there was like all this talk about freedom and like, opportunity in America and just like getting out of this country. And so my parents are from the north/south/central South. So they didn't know each other at that time, right? But their journeys are really similar, where they both decided that they each would leave the country or escape from the country. And it both took them several attempts before they were actually successful. But long story short, they were successful. They got on a boat. They were at sea for a few months. And then they actually coincidentally both ended up in a refugee camp in Hong Kong, where they stayed for a few years, so 1.5 to 2 years each. And then they still didn't meet each other at the time. And then eventually they were both sponsored to come to Boston, Massachusetts. And that's where they settled and met each other.
Awesome. It's a topic that's come up quite a lot recently on the podcast. And we've talked about it. Obviously, a lot of people share similar experiences to your parents and to yourself. As I said, we've interviewed over the last couple of seasons Swiss Vietnamese, German Vietnamese, all with similar backgrounds. And one thing I've mentioned, I don't know, have you listened to the Vietnamese Boat People podcast?
Yeah, yes, I have.
So I keep mentioning that because I want people to go and listen to it. It's a lot of episodes now, but I have listened to quite a few of the ones in the beginning, and I've read some books on it as well. And it's just something that's so harrowing and so shocking to read about. And meeting people like yourself always is heartening to see, because you can see what the positive outcomes can be for people, for your family, and like yourself. And then it obviously really brings it home when you read about refugees today. And it hurts me when you think about how terrible refugees are treated worldwide, in my country and in America, or not maybe treated, but ignored or not let in. And you're just like, how are we not learning from the past? Like, we know that these horrible things happened before, and we know the amazing things that can happen from letting refugees in. I don't understand why we still can't be accepting of people that are fleeing basically horrible situations. In the UK, we have some horrible people like Katie Price, who said some horrible, disgusting things about not letting refugees in and things like that, people fleeing war and persecution. And you're like, why would you not want to accept these people in that are fleeing the country? So I divert. I'm going on a tangent, but I have reached out to Sarah Nguyen from the Vietnamese Boat People. I'm waiting to hear back, so I really would love to get her on the show soon. So Tracy, I said this on the last episode. If you're listening, get in touch because we want to put you on.
Yeah, Tracy is great. We worked with her recently on an April 30th social media storytelling campaign. Yeah, it's capturing the stories of my parents' generation and the generation of people who lived through the war in Vietnam and escaped the country and came to the US or really settled in any country around the world. It's such a unique and powerful experience that is so important for the whole world. Like, as you mentioned, there's so many takeaways from there. And at the same time, it's also a very difficult conversation to have. Many people who had lived those experiences, they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to relive it. Yet folks of like my generation, we want to capture it so much. We want to like learn from it and just like know everything we can. And so it's kind of like this really odd tension of wanting to preserve the legacy of our community through these lived experiences and stories, and also want to respect the people who maybe just don't want to talk about it because it was so traumatic. So it's a constant tension and battle, I think, for my community, and very grateful to people like Tracy at Vietnamese Folk People Podcast who are able to capture at least a good chunk of it.
Yeah, it's something I've definitely learned from talking to so many people on the podcast, that most parents don't talk about it, which makes complete sense. Why would you want to talk about this harrowing experience? But I think as well, then, like you mentioned as well, then the children, they want to know and connect with their roots and find out what exactly happened. So yeah, I do think it's good that Tracy is making that podcast and sharing those stories. That's kind of why I asked that question as well. Some people are comfortable talking about it, some not. But even here in Vietnam, we've interviewed someone on the podcast, someone who's a friend of mine who his father fought in the war, but he would never talk to him about it. It's not something that you grow up and your dad sits you around and be like, right, I'm going to tell you a war story. He said that most of his awareness of his dad being in the war was just overhearing his dad talking about it with friends while they're drinking beer, which makes sense. Now, let's move on a little bit. I've been very excited to talk to you about coffee. If anyone is watching on Zoom, I'm drinking my morning coffee. This is one of the earliest podcasts I've ever done. So Sarah you're in Brooklyn, right?
Yes, correct.
So Sarah's in Brooklyn, New York at the moment. It's Monday evening. So it's the latest interview that she's ever done and the earliest one for me. So we're dealing with the time difference. So I'm starting my day with a coffee. You'll be able to see me drinking it if you're watching on the Zoom. I'm a massive coffee fan, so I've been very excited to talk to you about it. Well, the first question I want to ask you about is you went on the Drew Barrymore show. How was that?
It was so surreal, Neil. It was crazy. Let me tell you about it, because Drew Barrymore is an icon. She is a living legend, and not just like an icon in Hollywood, but she's been a constant presence in my family, in my entire life, right? So my parents came to Boston in like 1981. E.T. came out in 1982. We all watched E.T. as a family, and then we rewatched it over like the VCR, the cassette tape, like over across the years, right? Throughout the 80s. So we grew up with Drew Barrymore. And then like my mom, I mean, she loves comedy. She loves romantic comedy because it's kind of a way for her to like feel good and happy after everything she's experienced. So she loves all of Drew Barrymore's movies. She can't stop talking about 50 First Dates with her and Adam Sandler. You know,
it's one of my favorite movies.
And that's one of my mom's favorite movies too. She always talks about her and Adam Sandler in that movie. Charlie's Angels for me and my parents and my sisters, who are like, we're three girls, 3 women now. We really grew up with Drew Barrymore, you know, and I'm not just saying that, but like it was such like a moment of escapism and joy for my parents and my family, and like so many family moments that were shared over a Drew Barrymore film. And so it was really crazy for me, and it was actually really crazy for my parents, who just viewed Drew Barrymore as like this iconic American star that they grew up with in America. And so to be invited to her show, and the way it happened was through a total inbound. An associate producer DM'd me on Instagram. I'm not paying for PR right now. So someone literally reached out over Instagram on a Wednesday. We Zoomed on a Thursday, and then I was filming on a Tuesday, right? It happened so fast, and it was really organic. And when I met Drew, she was so freaking sweet and just like so down to earth, and a very, very thoughtful and intentional and socially aware person. You could tell that she was really genuine about wanting to have me on the show. And she before we started filming, it was like around March, there's a lot of violence around, AAPIs and against Asian elders being reported in the news constantly. Before we even started filming, she checked in with me and was like, hey, do you want to talk about the violence that's happening against the AAPI community right now? Or do you want to just talk about your experience as an entrepreneur? She was like, we don't want to force you to talk about this, and we don't want you to feel like you're only here to talk about that. Talk about whatever you want to talk about and however you want to represent yourself on the show. And I thought that was really cool of her. And of course, I was like, I definitely want to talk about what's happening because it's very important to me, and it's very important that we use the platform to amplify it. But overall, that we had so much fun together. And then I don't know if you saw, but she actually brought me back for a second time.
No, I haven't seen that one yet.
She brought me back for a second time in May. So the first time was March, then they invited me back in May, and that in itself, the second segment was a coffee and cooking segment, and that in itself says a lot about her and her team of it wasn't just a one-off moment. It was let's bring Sarah back. Let's extend this moment. Let's build a relationship. I really just appreciate a level of allyship because I'll tell you, Neil, I've had another daytime television show under the name of a pop star, and her team reached out to me, inviting me to be in the show after the Drew Barrymore. And oh yeah, we're doing a program to support Asian Americans, to support anti-Asian violence. And then they were like, but you have to pay $10,000 to be in the show, right? Yeah. And I was like, okay, this is not how you go about this. It is not my responsibility as an Asian American woman in the Asian-owned business to donate $10,000 to fight anti-Asian violence. You should be donating $10,000. But the point here with the story is Drew Barrymore was really great. The experience being in the show twice in 3 months was wonderful, and a really big moment for my parents, and I would say just for representation in general of my community.
If you're thinking of starting your own podcast and you don't know where to begin, then get in touch with me. Not only do I make a Vietnam podcast, I make smarter podcasting, and I run 7 Million Big Podcasts, where we help people make the best podcast possible. If you want to start a podcast, book a free discovery call with me, and I can chat you through very quickly what you need to do, how I can help you, and how we can help you make the best podcast possible. So get in touch. The link is in the show notes.
That is amazing. Were you completely fangirling the whole time, or did you keep it together? Were you cool? Were you what do I do? How do I act?
No way. You cannot keep it cool around Drew Barrymore. I was totally fangirling. My heart was racing. I was so nervous. I was freaking out. I mean, she's a fucking icon. Even the second time, I was more nervous the second time for some reason. It's funny, my mom, so the second time we were filming, it was on a Wednesday, and on the Sunday prior to that Wednesday, I was visiting my mom in Boston. We were grilling, and we made moon thịt nướng, right? Grilled pork belly. And then my mom was like, it's so good, right? And my mom was like, can you bring this to Drew? So she packs a serving in a Tupperware of moon thịt nướng, and she put a piece of tape on it. She wrote Drew Barrymore's name on it. And she was and she also packed a bag of toothpicks in there for her crew to have samples. She's like, can you bring this to Drew? I'm like, sure. I'm like, listen, I don't know what her dietary restrictions are. No promises, but I'll bring it. So on the day of filming, I brought it, and then I ran to Drew in the hallway. We were super excited to see each other. She gave me a hug. I was like, by the way, Drew, my mom brought you some moon thịt nướng and some toothpicks for the crew. No pressure, but if you want to try it, it's here. And she was so excited. And if you watch the second segment, she actually mentions my mom's moon thịt nướng in the show. She's like, Sarah's mom brought us her famous pork. And I was like, ah! My mom was just, can you imagine? My mom is being recognized on the Drew Barrymore show for her cooking. It was insane. It's wild.
Amazing. So the next segment needs to have your mum on the show.
Totally. She would kill it.
You have to suggest that. Now, one of the things that made me laugh so much, so I watched the segment, and so I know the job of a TV presenter is to be excited about things. And I'm sure Drew Barrymore is naturally a very excitable person. But her excitement about Finn Coffee made me laugh so much. I was like, how can you get... But because I know it's for TV. So my wife is from America and we went back there a few years ago and we took Fin coffee with us. We took condensed milk. We took Vietnamese coffee beans and we were traveling around Texas, visiting our family. And everywhere we went, every morning, I was like, right, guys, you've got to try Vietnamese coffee. It's the best coffee in the world. And like Drew Barrymore, when she had that sip and she's like, oh my goodness, Vietnamese coffee is rocket fuel. My friend's just started a satirical website and he just posted an article this week that made me laugh so hard. It was like, Irishman finally falls asleep 5 years after having a Vietnamese coffee. I'll send it to you. But Drew Barrymore's enthusiasm and excitement, I'm sure it was genuine, but it just seemed so fake for TV because I went around America pouring people Fin coffee. And every time I did it, they were like, oh yeah, cool.
Well, Neil, I gotta be honest. What coffee were you serving them? Because Drew Barrymore, she was drinking my coffee with supply. So let's not discredit her reaction. It wasn't just the Fin coffee. It was specifically Win Coffee Supply coffee beans, okay?
No,
So
it was more just the fact when you like put it in the Fin, she's like, oh my God, wow. And I'm like, okay. But I'm a bit cynical because I'm like, I live here in Vietnam. So for me, that's just like that's how I make my coffee every day. So it's not like this amazing experience. So I did think it was really cool and it was really cute that she got so excited about something that for me, even as a Westerner, I'm like, yeah, it's coffee. That's how you.
Yeah, but Neil, it's all like social context, right? And societal context. Like the Fin filter is not new. It's been around for like decades. And like you mentioned, for you and many people in Vietnam, it's a daily experience. But for many people in the US, they have never heard of it. They've never seen it. They've never experienced it. And I'm not surprised that she was so amazed because the Fin is an amazing brew tool. Like it's small, it's compact, there's no paper waste, it's super easy to use. It brews a perfect concentrated cup in 5 minutes. Like it's an incredible brew tool that just has not gotten a lot of love outside of Vietnam. So, and I think that just kind of speaks to this larger thing of like, just like social culture context, like what's not new to one person can be like brand new to another person. And I think that is the beauty of when we have more, diversity in consumer experiences. We're able to share things. Like I'm not new to the Fin filter. I grew up with it, right? But now through my mission and through Win Coffee Supply, I'm sharing it with like most of Americans and most of mainstream American. They're like, did you invent this? This is amazing, right? Literally people are like, did you invent this tool? I'm like, I did not invent it. It's been around for generations. But it's just like, it takes a certain experience and a certain person, a certain entrepreneur, certain like lived experience to share something culturally different. And I think that is where so much beauty lies of when we can share different culture experiences and really have a connection together.
No, I'm just making fun of her. I thought it was really cute, but I also was like, wow, I've never seen anyone so excited over a Fin coffee before.
You've been in Nam for too long, that's why.
I'm 100%. Yeah, I've been here too long. That's what I'm saying. I'm a little bit like, meh, it's coffee. But I did do it. I took it all around America. We literally brought, it wasn't your beans, but it was Vietnamese coffee beans. I brought condensed milk. I brought a Fin. We were going all around Texas, the different families. And we're like, right, let me make you this coffee. Everyone loved it. But I never saw anyone get as excited as Drew Barrymore about it.
Next time you do your family tour, bring some Win Coffee Supply beans, okay?
I will do, definitely. So let's talk more about coffee because I don't want to put down all my other guests, but this is one of the most excited. I've been the most excited I've been to talk to someone for a podcast because I feel like there's a lot of topics that I want to talk about. And one of them is coffee. So as you can tell, I've already had my morning coffee. So I'm starting to get more excited now. And it is one of my biggest passions. Now, as I was reading more about Win Coffee Supply and your mission, one of the things that broke my heart was reading about in America. I didn't know this, that it's marketed. It's like a buzzword to sell Vietnamese coffee, but it's not Vietnamese coffee. And so explain to the listeners more about that and then how that's driven your mission to highlight Vietnamese coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. Around 2016, I think Vietnamese food and culture was really having an emergence and a big moment in mainstream America. Similar to how like Chinese food was really popularly known, and then it was like Japanese food and Thai food, and like Vietnamese food was kind of like being discovered by like non-Vietnamese people in America. And on a similar wavelength, Neil, I noticed that when I would go into these different specialty coffee shops and these hipster cafes, they started throwing up Vietnamese iced coffee on the menu. And initially I was like, oh, this is cool. This is a moment. This is a culture moment. Vietnamese iced coffee is getting recognition on these menus, right? But then every time I would try the Vietnamese iced coffee meal, it never tasted like Vietnamese coffee because, Vietnamese Robusta coffee beans is really a big part of Vietnamese coffee culture. Yes, Arabica is growing, but, historically, Robusta is a big part of Vietnamese coffee culture. And I would always ask the barista at these cafes, what's in your Vietnamese iced coffee? And they would say, oh, it's a house espresso or a house cold brew. That's from Ethiopia or from Brazil or from Colombia or from any country, from Africa or South America that was more in the specialty coffee scene at the time. And so I felt like this was really problematic for so many reasons. One, it's just pure false advertising and miseducation for consumers because Vietnamese coffee has a very distinct taste, right? Arabica and Robusta beans are pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum. Two, it renders the actual producers of the coffee invisible, like the Ethiopian coffee farmers or the Brazilian coffee farmers. Just call it Ethiopian coffee with sweetened condensed milk, right? Like, let's do justice to the actual producers here. Three, what we're seeing is a group of people and businesses who want to profit off of the cultural cachet of a Vietnamese iced coffee concept, but yet the producers and the creators of this cultural product and this concept, being Vietnamese people and producers and farmers, we're not benefiting at all from this transaction, right? Which is probably the biggest problem to me. And so from there, I just started looking into it more and like, why aren't they just using real Vietnamese coffee beans? And that's when I realized that the specialty coffee industry in America was really built around this idea and this narrative of 100% Arabica is superior. And at the same time, they built this narrative explicitly saying that Vietnamese coffee is cheap, Robusta coffee is inferior, and that they don't really belong in specialty coffee culture, right? Which I found to be very problematic because these are ultimately all social constructs, right? In my research, I discovered that Vietnam is the #2 producer of coffee in the world, which blew my mind because I didn't know that as a Vietnamese American. Because originally I was like, well, maybe Vietnam is not involved in specialty coffee because they don't make coffee. Like maybe there's just no source there, right? But no, Vietnam is the #2 producer of coffee in the world. And the fact that I didn't know that, Neil, for me, screams lack of transparency, lack of visibility, and lack of representation. When we have non-transparent supply chains in any food industry, be it seafood or coffee, most often than not, it means that there's an exploitative labor cycle at the end of that, right? Because when people don't have visibility or representation, they can't properly advocate for themselves, right? So for me as a Vietnamese American, I feel like there's a huge injustice happening to Vietnamese people and producers. They have contributed largely to coffee experiences around the world. They touch lives around the world. And there's a huge missed opportunity, not just for coffee farming, but also for culture connection of like, oh, my coffee is made by a Vietnamese person. Like, that's pretty cool, right? So with that in mind, I really wanted to change all of this, right? Because specialty coffee as it exists today, Neil, is not just something that we drink. Specialty coffee didn't just grow out of the ground on its own. Specialty coffee is a collective investment from people all along the supply chain to build a more sustainable and equitable world, right? It requires producers and buyers working with farmers and saying, hey, did you know that if you use these organic practices and these all natural biofertilizers and you handpick just the ripe cherries instead of grabbing all the ripe and unripe cherries, you get a better product. If you get a better harvest, you can sell it for a higher price. And then the buyer sells it to the roaster and says, this is a single origin XYZ. It's 90% handpicked red cherries. It's XYZ processed. The roasters buy it for a better price, right? The roasters sell it to the baristas, and the baristas are educating consumers. Hey, this cup of coffee is a single origin XYZ. It's $6 instead of $3, right? It is really a collective investment from people all along the supply chain. But when it came to Vietnam, Neil, people were not willing to apply those values or that investment to Vietnam. They would just write on Vietnam as saying, Vietnam doesn't count. Vietnam is instant coffee. Vietnam is cheap. Vietnam is Robusta, which I really felt like was wrong and fucked up, and it needed to change. So that's where I stepped in and I said, well, I want to change this because if Vietnam is the #2 producer of coffee in the world, that means the product is already there. we have a huge opportunity to improve the lives of farmers all across the country and improve agriculture sustainability simply by making the product that's already there better, right? We could change so many lives and change the landscape by just making what's there better. And it just requires someone to come in and just look at it a different way. And so that's where When Coffee Supply was born. And that's what we're trying to do.
I love your enthusiasm and passion. It's awesome. I can see you getting more excited as we're talking about it, which is cool. I think, again, as someone who lives here and loves the coffee, even just recently when we went up to Dong Nai and Dalat and you drive through, and for people who don't live here or haven't been here, like there's literally just coffee beans everywhere, like by the side of the road, just sitting there drying. It's like there's so much coffee beans. They're not like locked up or anything like that. They just sit there by the side of the road, right? It's crazy. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I wondered if this was a challenge for you, is convincing people of the quality and the safety of the beans. Because for us, when we first came to Vietnam 5 years ago, the first thing that people told us when we would get a coffee from like the street coffee would be, oh, better be careful because there's a lot of fake coffee out there. And you can Google it and find it. I mean, even I don't know if you were aware of this story. It was about 2, maybe 3 years ago. They found out that someone was selling coffee here in Vietnam, I think for the local market, not export. And it was using reused batteries within the coffee. And when we first came here 5 years ago, there was somebody did a test of like coffee sold on the street, and a huge percentage, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but a large number was fake coffee. They were doing roasted soybeans, which is actually carcinogenic and unsafe. And so from that perspective, is that then difficult to then explain? I don't know if anyone in America would be aware of that, but if they're so convinced of Arabica and things like that, to then be like, hey, do you want to try these Vietnamese Robusta coffee beans? Is anyone like, oh, I'm not sure about that?
Yeah, great question. Because those are everything that you described, Neil, those are truths, right? And those are realities, right? And that is part of the reality that we live in with this coffee industry. And so I'm not dismissing that those things exist. I'm just saying that it can change, right? With the willingness from people all along the supply chain. But to your question of like, was it hard to convince people? To be honest, it wasn't really, because I think a lot of those ideas weren't really existing in American consumers' minds. I think it existed a lot in industry folks, right? The people who may work in the coffee industry. But the people who I were interacting with directly, like they drink the coffee, taste the coffee, they like it or they don't like it, right? But because of these things, Neil, and my desire to reframe the narrative and show that Vietnamese coffee can produce specialty coffee if we work together, that is why I decided to import green beans and roast in Brooklyn, New York, right? Because I wanted to align myself with how the specialty coffee industry in the United States was producing product, right? So, because I had an opportunity to fully roast and package in Vietnam, right? And the costs are different there. But me, myself, personally, I wanted to be able to offer craft roasted, small batch roasted on the ProBat manually, roasted on the Loring, roasted locally, roasted weekly, right? Because it would communicate specialty, it would communicate quality. And also for me, myself, as an entrepreneur and as a founder of the company, I want to make sure that I could touch the product and attest to the quality of the product by literally seeing the green beans before we roasted it, right? So that is in terms of how we are developing our product in the supply chain, meaning importing greens and roasting in Brooklyn. That is how we are assuring the quality of our beans. And otherwise, this pattern of like cheap coffee products that are in the market, that is going to exist for as long as we allow it to, right? And until people say, hey, we want a more sustainable Vietnamese coffee product, it's not going to put any pressure on corporations or conglomerates or producers and farmers to change their ways, right? And for example, I don't know if you saw recently, but Kirin, this big company in Japan, it was just announced that Kirin is now investing in sustainable coffee farming in Vietnam because they're receiving pressure from their consumers for more sustainable coffee products. And the more we can change the perceptions of Americans here from just dismissing Vietnam as like, they're cheap, they're instant. If we keep perpetuating that narrative, then that's all Vietnamese producers can participate in, right? That will be the only that would be the only opportunity they have to produce and sell their product into that market. But we can change our perception of being like, sure, Vietnamese coffee has entered cheap and instant markets, but you know what? We want sustainable, single origin, organic Vietnamese coffee products. Where can we get that? Where can we see that, right? All of a sudden, we have massive green bean buyers talking to Vietnamese producers. We have Vietnamese producers and growers learning about how to produce specialty coffee. We have Vietnamese farmers producers learning about 80 points, 90 points, 95 points, about hand picking, about all these things, right? So it's all a collective investment. But that was a long way of saying, like, yes, no, not really. And it takes effort and willingness from everyone to change an old system.
That's really exciting. I'd love it if I go back to America when post-pandemic, when travel is allowed and suddenly you can see good Vietnamese coffee everywhere. That would be super exciting and be like a new thing, but not like a fake thing, like a buzzword like Vietnamese coffee. Like I said to my friend about the problem of just adding condensed milk. And he said the first thing he said is like, but in Spain, they add condensed milk to coffee. It's not Vietnamese just by adding condensed milk.
Exactly. I want to add to that because that's actually a narrative that we try to challenge as well here, that Vietnamese coffee is not synonymous with sweet condensed milk, because there are many cultures around the world that also use sweet condensed milk, like Spain in the Café Bonbon, right? In Thailand, they also have sweet condensed milk. So it's not right to just reduce Vietnamese coffee to sweet condensed milk, because we don't reduce Ethiopian coffee or Brazilian coffee or Colombian coffee to anything. Vietnamese coffee should be allowed to be coffee beans, and they should be allowed to exist in all their versatility, whether it's through the bean filter or the Chemex or the pour over or espresso, with oat milk, with almond milk, with cream and sugar, or sweet condensed milk, right? So part of our work is also expanding this narrative of what is Vietnamese coffee and what can it be, right? And I want to add something to what you said earlier, Neil, about if you came to Vietnam, if you came to the United States and seeing quality Vietnamese coffee, I want to share with you some really cool facts about some things that we've been tracking here on our side about the rise of Vietnamese coffee in the United States. For starters, we've received over 500 plus inbounds to serve our coffee at different businesses around the country. So over 500 plus inbounds since 2019. That speaks to the interest and the awareness and the demand for Vietnamese coffee. I've received, I can't remember this number, but countless inbounds about selling Vietnamese green beans, right? Like from roasters and other cafes, like, do you sell your green beans? Because people now want to roast Vietnamese coffee, but they don't quite have the access yet because it's being developed, right? Vietnamese cafe openings around the country, from what we've been tracking, Neil, is growing up to 1,100% year over year. And that's from the cafes that we tracked alone. But also, I don't know if you saw this, but King Coffee, which is a Vietnamese franchise, recently opened their very first cafe in Anaheim, California. They've announced 20 new stores for 2021, and they've announced 100 new stores by franchise by 2022. So there is a wave of Vietnamese cafes and Vietnamese coffee culture happening in the United States, and it's happening right now, right? And with all of this awareness and this appreciation for not just the coffee or the sweet that's built, but also for the culture, that's going to dramatically impact the industry abroad as well.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, I'm hoping then I will see the difference when I come back. But now you know what's going to happen. When I have a Vietnamese coffee, when I go back to the States, I'm going to be like, right, is this really a Vietnamese coffee? I'm going to be asking, I'm like, what beans is this? Is this Vietnamese or is it Ethiopian? Now, to bring it back to Vietnam, something that I don't know how much you are aware of this, and I am a coffee snob, not in the way that like I want Chemex or pour over or whatnot. I know what I like and I want what I like, okay? And I like my Vietnamese coffee, and I do like Arabica as well, and I like a cappuccino, but I like them in their own right. One of the things that's become really common in Saigon over the last 5 years, when I first got here 5 years, non-existent, now it's really common. They're doing what you're describing, but they're doing it here in Saigon. So espresso machines have proliferated, roadside espresso machines, like literally, I don't know how much they cost, but you buy an espresso machine, you put it on the side of the road and you start selling coffee. But they will sell you a Vietnamese coffee. So I'll go and ask for a café suada, itsua. And then this happened to me just a couple of weeks ago. Then I hear the coffee machine go, And I went straight up to the counter and I was like, oh, in my broken Vietnamese, I was like, is this the Cafe Suada? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, just just make that an espresso then. I will not buy. One of my biggest pet peeves is if they try and serve you a Cafe Suada made from an espresso machine. I'm like, no, a Cafe Suada is made in a fin. That's an espresso.
I have to correct you, Neil. Cafe Suada is coffee with milk and ice.
No,
so
I know that.
It could be espresso coffee with milk and ice. What you really want is café fin.
Yeah, I mean, I know the translation, but I mean, like, for me, if I'm asking for a Cafe Suada, it's a Vietnamese thin coffee with condensed milk and ice.
I know what you mean, though. I totally get it because when the last time I was in Vietnam in 2019, I was also experiencing the growth of espresso machines, and so many places I would go to, I'd be like, Café Sarah, and they would pull an espresso shot, add a little sweet condensed milk and ice, and I was like, at Vietnamese American is missing. I'm like, I don't want the fiend experience. But that was too fast for me, right? So I definitely had my own moments where I was like, wait, where's the feed? You're evolving. No. But I get it. Like, it's so much more economical and fast for them to produce that.
That's what it is, right? It's faster. So, like, you can make it in an espresso instantly, but the fin takes like a few minutes. But that's what I'll wait. This is Vietnam. We can be a bit slower. I want to enjoy my coffee. So for me, yeah, that's a massive pet peeve. If I hear that machine going, I am up and I'm like, and I know what coffee shops, because see, I think they should market it as espresso suada, not cafe suada. I think it should be two products. And then if it's espresso suada, it's an espresso with condensed milk versus cafe suada.
This is fascinating because this is kind of like the intersections of culture, right? And it's like, because Vietnam is especially Saigon is a very transient city right now. So we're having like this really interesting moment in time where there's so much like collision and intersection of culture. So I agree. We need some standardized language of like Café Sera, Fa de Espresso, or Café Sera, like, you need to say like Café Sera and then the brew afterwards, so people are on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you see why I didn't start our podcast talking about coffee, because I knew if I did that, then we wouldn't talk about anything else. That was definitely on purpose because I wanted to ask you more questions than just about coffee. So we'll move on because we could talk all day about this, and I can see you're getting more excited and more passionate as we're talking. I've run out of my coffee, so I'm going to need to go and make another one soon. We finish the podcast with the same questions every episode, right? And right now the first question, I'm interested to hear your answer because you obviously live in New York, not Saigon. And this question is inspired by Saigon, that as the wealth has increased here, the amount of luxurious cars has increased exponentially as well. So it's normal to walk down the street and see a Bentley or a Mercedes or a Lamborghini or a Porsche. But at the same time, the paintwork doesn't match the class of the car. Look, I'll just be honest, some horrendous cars. And the best example that I give to people is recently there was a bedazzled Mercedes where the whole Mercedes was decked out in silver glitter. Being in New York, do you have a similar, or even when you've been to Vietnam, what's the craziest car that you've seen?
I feel like Saigon has more extravagant cars than New York City, because I was thinking about this question earlier and I was like, the cars here are boring as fuck. Like, the only thing I could think about would be like graffiti trucks. But really, actually, because New York has like really bad potholes, the streets here are really like poorly constructed and like not taking care of their potholes everywhere. There are like bumps everywhere. So I feel like there aren't really nice cars. At least I haven't seen any. And also New York City is a very train-centric city, right? So I feel like I have not seen any nice cars here. I myself drive a Toyota Camry, like super basic. So I cannot recall an interesting, a nice car here recently.
I thought that might be a bit of a more difficult question for you. This one might be easier. Have you tried durian?
I actually haven't tried durian. My mom loves it so much, and I've always been around it, but I've actually never tried it. Isn't that horrible?
You are the first guest that's answered no to that question.
I don't know why. I had no idea why. Yeah, I have not. Interesting.
What's your mum's name? Nhi.
N-I.
N-I. Nhi. make sure that Sarah tries some durian soon, okay? Because we're going to come back and find out whether you like it or not.
And you know what? I should try it. Next time my mom's eating it, I will try it.
I'm sure it's available and you can get it in some specialty supermarkets and things like that.
Seasonally, we can get here.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on. So what's something that happens in America that would look strange in Vietnam?
I think when people have hamster pets here.
Wait, what?
People who keep hamsters as pets here.
Oh, I thought you meant like took them out for walks.
Oh, no. I think just keeping hamsters as pets in America, I think that's odd. I think that'd be odd in Vietnam because they look like rats, really. Like, I know in a social context in America, like hamsters are cute, but really they're kind of like rats. And so I think in Vietnam that would seem weird because the concept of having dogs and cats as pets is kind of more of like a recent thing, I feel. So hamsters,
that was the most unexpected answer that I would have expected. And hamster, I mean, do people in Vietnam not keep like rodents in cages? Because that is quite normal even from Scotland. Like my first pet was a hamster. People have guinea pigs. People don't have that in Vietnam.
No, they're not keeping rodents in cages as pets in Vietnam. They barely just started keeping dogs and cats as pets.
Which, that's very true as well. Yeah, that's like having a household pet is quite a new thing, right? So conversely, what's something that happens in Vietnam that would be looked at strangely in America?
I feel like, I don't know if it's something that happens. It's more of like, the first thing that came to mind were like the toilets in the ground, like where you have to stand, where it's like literally there's a hole in the ground, you have to squat on top instead of like a toilet. I've been to so many parts of it now where like that's just a situation. So I think that's something if you've never experienced a non-toilet situation, but really just literally a hole in the ground, you got to kind of like squat into, like that's kind of like probably something new to get used to.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came to Southeast Asia in general, that was one of my biggest fears and was worries. And even now, if you travel outside of Saigon or depending where you go, before you open the door of a bathroom, there's that intrepidation of like, what kind of toilet is it going to be? More often than not in Vietnam, it is a porcelain toilet bowl. But when you travel, like I was in Myanmar a couple of years ago and I got really sick. And the only toilet they had was a squat toilet. And that has to be one of the lowest points of my life when you are very ill and the only amenities is a squat toilet. I'll maybe cut this bit out because that's absolutely disgusting.
I want to add to the squat toilet, it's also like you have to like grab water with a bucket and then like pour it into the hole in order to flush it. There's no flush handle. You have to like literally scoop water from a hole and pour it into the squat toilet. But I do want to say though, like physically speaking, it is healthier to be in a squatting position when you're doing your business than sitting.
Oh, I've seen this infographic, because this is disgusting because your bowels are like more aligned,
yes,
right?
Exactly. So Southeast Asian is something.
But you got to be good at the Asian squat to be able to do that, which is just one of the most amazing things in the world that in Vietnam and in Asia, they can just squat for an indefinite amount of time in any situation, mostly for no reason, like just on the side of the street or just chilling out, like just in the Asian squat.
Yeah, it requires a level of flexibility that must be built up.
It's definitely something you need to have done from a young age, right? And you watch people who are like older who do it, and it's like, that's incredible that you can still do that. So thank you so much. This has been awesome. I've had so much fun. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I've been fangirling over you like you were with Drew Barrymore. Tell all of our listeners more about where they can follow you, find you. I'm really sorry, we've kind of run out of time. We didn't even get a chance to talk about your activism, which I really did want to talk about as well. So give a quick shout out about the work you're doing is in terms of the Stop Asian Hate and working with the Asian and Pacific Islander communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, like in America, if people aren't aware, there's just been a huge rise and surge in anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian racism, where a lot of our Asian American elders, like grandparents, elderly folks, are just being straight up attacked in the streets. And a lot of it It stemmed from the scapegoating of COVID-19 against Asian folks. It stems directly from our previous president's language, scapegoating Asian people for COVID-19. So it's been a very difficult time in the US right now for Asian Americans. A lot of us don't feel safe. A lot of us don't feel like our parents are safe when we step out because these attacks are happening at any moment and in major cities everywhere. So for me, in addition to a lot of the fundraisers and the community actions we've done, I really think at the end of the day, just like Win Coffee Supply is the work. Like building Win Coffee Supply, building a new system in an ecosystem rooted in transparency, visibility, representation, and equity is part of the work of building just a better world here. So if people want to follow us and follow our journey, we put all of our most exciting news on Instagram first and foremost. So it's at Win Coffee Supply, where that's on Facebook, Twitter, everywhere. We also have a website. We're not currently shipping to Vietnam, but if you're anywhere else in the world, try us out. We ship nationwide into a few international countries. It's wincoffeesupply.com. Or if you're not able to purchase from us, I highly would recommend joining our email list. I send out a monthly newsletter and a monthly letter from me directly about our journey. And me personally, you can find me on Instagram at 1 ounce gold, ONEOUNCEGOLD.
Awesome. I thought about that question about like, can you buy your coffee here in Vietnam? But it seems kind of reductive that if you were to export coffee beans to Brooklyn, roast them, and then send them back to Vietnam, I feel like that would make it extremely expensive.
It would, but Neil, I've had people in Vietnam who have asked me to ship them coffee.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's really fascinating. And I'm like, you have this, right? It's Vietnamese coffee, but it speaks to the power of brand and cultural cachet. I think a lot of them is really fascinated about our Made in Brooklyn story, us being on Drew Barrymore. It just speaks to this larger power of cultural exchange.
Well, post-pandemic, when we can get back to the States, I will be definitely seeking out Win Coffee Supply if I come back to New York, which I used to live there, so I love it. I've not been back to New York for a long time, over 10 years. So I'm excited to go back. I'm sure it's a completely different city to the one that I lived in from all accounts that I've heard. But I'm excited to get back one day and I'll try your coffee as well. So listen, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. It's been great to talk, and hopefully we'll talk again soon, and I will see you when you come back to Vietnam.
Yes, I look forward to it, Neil. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. Cheers.